Hi, everyone. In the next 20 minutes, I want to talk about Israel's regional strategy, how it sees itself within the region, why it creates bilateral and multilateral connections in the region, and how it uses gas to do so. And what does it mean regarding its future prospects for gas exports to Europe and this creation of a new region called the East Mediterranean. So I'm going to share a presentation for you to see. Okay. So since its establishment in 1948, Israel always considered itself kind of, you can say, under a siege mentality, where it saw itself as a virtual island surrounded by enemies, by hostile countries, kind of a lone country in the world that's not really connected to any region. It's definitely not part of the Middle East in terms of economics, infrastructure, culture, religion, etc. And it wants to be part of Europe, but it is also not there. And it's kind of stuck in the middle. And Israel has always been dependent because it's kind of like a virtual island. It's disconnected from the countries around it. Definitely in the first years of its establishment, Israel was completely dependent and still is on imports by sea. Almost 97% of Israel's imports are by sea. So the safety of its waterways, securing its waterways and its imports has always been a huge part of Israel's national security agenda and considerations. And Israel for many years has been under various economic embargoes. It has went to war with the countries around it, especially Egypt, for blocking certain straits like the Straits of Tiran that lead to Eilat. In order to secure these waterways, and especially when it comes to energy. Since its establishment, Israel has been under an oil boycott by most of the Arab countries, and in 1973, after the Yom Kippur War, by almost all of OPEC members as well. And so the struggle to make sure that Israel can get and open waterways to get imports, either from the Red Sea or from the Mediterranean, has always been part of its top national security priority. So in order to overcome this kind of siege mentality, Israel has developed what you can call a periphery alliance, where because it saw itself as surrounded by a ring of enemies, it sought to create an outer ring of friends. It sought anyone who was willing to cooperate with it, any non-Arab state, any minority that has an issue with the Arab world, and you can cooperate with it, especially if it makes geographic sense. So Israel tried to cooperate and create bilateral deals in the 50s with Turkey, with the Christians in Ethiopia and Sudan, with Iran, mainly because of where they sat, because they sit right on very important waterways and straits, and aligning with them will allow you to get trade and imports through them and prevent blockage, which is something that Israel had to deal with during every one of its wars in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And so part of this idea of an outer ring strategy was to create the periphery alliance, especially with Turkey, Iran, and Ethiopia. The most successful of these transit routes, of these alliances, was with Iran. Throughout the 60s and 70s, most of Israel's oil, 85% of Israel's oil came from Iran. So under all of the embargoes, OPEC embargo, etc., still it got oil from Iran, and they even built a pipeline in Israel to transport oil, the Katza pipeline. Israel and Iran built it together. The problem began in the Yom Kippur War in 1973, where oil prices shot up. A lot of countries stopped selling oil to Israel because they were afraid that the Arab world will boycott them. And in 1979, Iran fell to the Islamic Revolution and completely cut off exports to Israel. So in the early 80s, Israel just doesn't have any oil. And it starts a scramble to find energy resources from anyone willing to sell it to. In the 70s until the 90s, it was from Mexico and Ecuador. Then during the 80s, they managed to get West Africa to sell it some oil. They switched a lot of the oil generation to coal generation, so they could buy it from South Africa, the coal. And it was very hard to convince a country to sell Israel oil during the 80s and 90s because they were afraid that if they sell oil to Israel, they will be boycotted as well. So Israel had to persuade them. They had to give them something, to offer them something that will make them worth the while to take the risk and sell Israel oil. And what Israel had that these countries wanted was weapons. It was really good weapons, Western level weapons. And so the connection between energy trade and arms trade and security cooperation became really, for Israel, became intertwined during these years until this day. And it affects kind of what we're seeing today. That's why I'm giving this background. It also means that Israel's energy deals tend to be very secretive, because every time it buys oil from a country, usually it also involves selling weapons. And so it doesn't publicize this. If you want to know where Israel gets its oil from, you need to discover it by yourself. Israel doesn't publish these kind of things. It considers it a security issue. Now, since the fall of the Soviet Union, Israel has been reliant on oil from former Soviet countries, mainly Russia, Kazakhstan, and Azerbaijan, which is much cheaper oil. It's much closer than from Mexico and Ecuador or Nigeria. And so this is the preferred source of oil, and almost all of Israel's oil comes from these countries. However, this idea of a periphery alliance, of gaining regional alliances with countries that sit in geographically strategic places, is still very much important, because while Israel is very dependent on these countries for its energy imports, all of the oil is coming through Turkey. Whether it's coming from Azerbaijan through the BTC pipeline, it's going through Turkey to the Ceyhan port. Whether it's coming from Russia or Kazakhstan, it's coming through tankers that are going through the Bosphorus port. And whether it's coming from the Kurdish autonomy in northern Iraq, according to foreign press, then that is also going through Turkey. And so Israel and Turkey are connected in the sense that Turkey is a major transit state for most of Israel's oil. And Israel is very reliant on oil. Its military is very reliant on oil. It needs a constant share of oil. It doesn't have any domestic consumption, domestic production. And so in return, for this transit, Israel also it gets crude oil and it distills it mainly in Haifa, and then it sells to Turkey petroleum products, right, gasoline, etc. And this has been a constant kind of agreement between Israel and Turkey. Despite everything that went on between Israel and Turkey in the past 10 years, the Marmara and all of the recent issue over the gas and Greece and Cyprus, the trade between Israel and Turkey has remained stable. It has gone down because the value of oil has gone down, but the volume of trade, this idea that Israel uses Turkey as a transit and sells it back distilled oil products, has remained constant despite all of the politics between the countries. It has not affected this mutual trade, and still it is very important for Israel to maintain a good relationship with Turkey, among other reasons, because of this geographical importance, because all of the oil goes through it. And so why did I give all of this background to kind of how Israel does what it does? The gas finds in the East Mediterranean in the past 10 years provide Israel with additional tools to do what it has always been doing, right? It gives it more tools to create these type of regional alliances beyond just weapons and oil as a way to connect with other countries around it, rather than just selling them weapons and buying oil. But the underlying logic of why Israel does what it does in the region has remained the same. It just received another tool to do this with, this time gas. But the logic is still the same for Israel: to increase trade, to secure trade routes via sea, and to prevent sanctions as much as possible. If one country sanctions you, then you can get it from another, which has always been a threat to Israel. And so gas is now being used to create this new dynamic. But for Israel, it's more than just a periphery alliance, an outer ring, another tool to cement relations. It also, since finding the gas, kind of changed Israel's perception of where it actually is. I said that Israel doesn't really belong to any region. It's not in the Middle East, and it wants to be kind of part of Europe, but it's not. And so Israel suddenly discovered that it has a new region forming, where it is no longer a black sheep of the Middle East, but rather the major economic force in a new region called the East Mediterranean, where countries like Egypt and Cyprus and Jordan reside, and most of them have a good, peaceful relationship with Israel. And Israel is a leading economic source in it. And so Israel started thinking differently about its spatial area, about its borders. Usually Israel tends to think about its borders as front lines. A border is a source of threat. It's where the enemy's military can come from. And so you need to protect the border. But suddenly Israel realized it actually has a peaceful border, a Western border, a maritime border with an EU member, with Cyprus. So it actually borders the European Union by sea. And so it suddenly changed its entire perspective. It realized that it has a sea, not just territorial waters, but a vast amount of sea that's as big as Israel itself, its EEZ. And so it really changed the perception and what it can do in this new region. And since then, Israel has been trying to form and cement this idea that there is a new region called the East Mediterranean, mainly because Israel is a very strong and positive force within this region. So it has everything to gain from creating this new region called the East Mediterranean and convincing Europe to treat it as if it's a different region than the rest of the Middle East. It also has to do with the perception that sometimes Europe has that the troubles of the Middle East are related to Israel and the conflict with the Palestinians. And so if Israel is not in the Middle East, right, perceptually, then it also is not. So there's a lot of kind of layers to this idea. And yet, with all of the promise around how the gas can create a new region for Israel, there's still a lot of headache involved when it comes to Israel's gas finds and how to export it, involved in the process, because there's a big gap between what Israel wants to do with the gas, what it aspires to do with the gas in terms of the region, versus what it can technologically and politically actually do. And this gap creates a lot of frustration. Now, no doubt the most impressive diplomatic achievement of the pipelines, of the gas, the pipeline diplomacy, is the close relationship that it has created between Greece, Cyprus, and Israel, what some would call a Aegean alliance, etc. But a very warm relationship that it was never outright confrontational, but it wasn't as warm as it is today. Now, it's important to understand that the gas didn't create this alliance and this relationship with Cyprus, and it was always there. And the main thing that brought them together in the past 10 years was mostly Turkey's kind of confrontational approach, both to Greece and Cyprus, but also mainly to Israel. And this has started before the gas finds, where Israel kind of felt like, right, the Marmara, everything, the maritime flotilla to Gaza, Erdogan's rhetoric against Israel made Israel feel like Turkey is no longer this part of the periphery alliance that it's trying to create. And so it sought Greece and Cyprus as a counterweight. And this is before the gas, but the gas really helped cement this and move this forward. And especially with its creation of an East Mediterranean gas forum, right? The EMGF, this idea that Israel is finally officially part of a forum that also has Arab states in it, which is something that it hasn't happened. And so the gas didn't create this alliance. It was mainly kind of Turkey's approach. In addition, for Israel, selling gas to the EU, to Cyprus and Greece, has to do with also this siege mentality and this constant fear of sanctions. Israel is very fearful of European sanctions, of EU sanctions, especially since 2015, when the EU decided to mark all of the products that are coming from Jewish settlements in the West Bank and in the Golan Heights, and mark them as coming from occupied territories. And Israel feared, especially Netanyahu, that this is just the first step towards an outright economic sanction or all-out boycott. And so the way kind of Netanyahu promoted the gas fields and the gas exports is, if we sell gas to EU members, mainly Cyprus and Greece, then they will not vote with the EU to sanction Israel, right? You need a unanimous vote in the EU to sanction another country. And they will not sanction Israel if they're getting gas from Israel. And so part of this idea is also to block sanctions. So it's still part of this siege mentality, this periphery alliance that Israel has been, that since Ben Gurion times in the 50s has been trying to promote. And so these are the kind of the two things that are driving this alliance for Israel, and why it's trying to create this new region. Now, just as how the gas didn't create this alliance, but it is helping and increasing this alliance and making it stronger and warmer, the gas, I believe, and I will argue, is also not the reason for the conflict in the East Mediterranean. It's true that the Turkish, Cypriot, Greek kind of maritime dispute over the gas is taking a lot of attention, but the reasons for this conflict are much more profound than just a gas field. And one of the best proofs for that was in the past 2 years, right, excluding the past 3 months. In the past 2 years, the gas prices in Europe have been very, very, very low, $2 per BTU. It didn't even justify economically to, even if you control the gas fields in the sea, it didn't make economic sense to actually take the gas out of the ground. And yet, in these 2 years of very, very low gas prices, Turkey just increased its confrontational approach in the sea. So it's not about the revenue from the gas. It's more profound than that. It has to do with Turkey's own long-standing issues with Europe, not even with Cyprus, but mainly with the European Union. Its desire to become a regional power and to assert its dominance in the region, become kind of its own to be a power to be respected once it realized it can't really join the European Union for various reasons, and to assert its dominance. And for these same reasons, Israel is also frustrated with Turkey, without any context with the gas, mainly the fact that Turkey, when I say Turkey, I mean Erdogan, I mean Erdogan's government, has decided to champion the Palestinian cause. In terms of rhetoric, it is one of the most kind of harsh rhetoric that you hear about Israel and the Palestinians. Erdogan keeps saying that there's genocide, that Israelis are worse than Hitler, things like that, that no other Arab countries are even saying anymore. And yet he's very confrontational, and it's not about the Palestinians. It's mainly about Turkey trying to champion the Palestinian cause because it creates credit in the Arab world for Turkey, where a lot of Arabs see Turkey as the last defender of the Palestinians, while all of the other Arab states, especially in the Gulf, have kind of so-called abandoned the Palestinian cause. And so Erdogan is taking it and is becoming really, really confrontational with Israel. And it creates a lot of frustration for Israel, because on the one hand, Israel does want cooperation from Turkey. Ideally, Israel would build a pipeline of gas to Turkey because it would be the cheapest pipeline to build. And it is, right, there's the oil relationship between Turkey, but it is constantly frustrated with this very, very confrontational policy by Erdogan. So I'm saying all of this because if we understand that gas is not the reason for these problems, then we can also understand that gas is not the solution for these problems. So just giving the gas fields or sharing the gas fields with Turkey will not by itself solve the issue. It's much more complicated. It requires deep dialogue, deep engagement, and a strong regional front versus Turkey to kind of show it that it needs to cooperate and not use force to get what it wants. So it needs to be a united. So this is another reason why this idea of an East Mediterranean gas forum, of an East Mediterranean region is important, because when you have a region against the country, then it's more difficult than kind of separating the region into different countries and taking them out one by one. From Israel's perspective, the fact that these sides are not getting along, Turkey and Cyprus and Greece, is a huge headache. The fact that it can't just be solved by sharing gas, because it deeply interferes with Israel's ability to realize its gas potential. Because Israel has the most to win from regional stability and from regional cooperation between Turkey and Cyprus and Greece and Egypt and Jordan and the Palestinians and Lebanon and even Syria. Israel will be the biggest winner from this new region, right? Rather than being part of the black sheep of the Middle East, because it has the most gas and it has the most revenue to benefit from this idea that all of the countries know how to play along, and private companies will come and look for gas if they know that there's no conflict here. Now, Israel has a problem. It has too much gas and it has too little gas. And both of them are a problem for Israel. So I'll explain what I mean. Israel has too much gas for its own good. It doesn't need so much gas. It found enough gas for the next 70 to 80 years, 80. And it doesn't need as much gas. And there's no reason for a developer to take out gas from the ground if you only need it in 30 years. So Israel, just from the smaller Tamar field, it supplies all of Israel's gas needs for the next 20 years. So there's no reason to develop Leviathan unless you find other markets for Leviathan other than Israel, because Israel currently doesn't really need the gas other than create kind of artificial competition. And so you need to sell the gas. And Israel found Jordan and it found Egypt to sell the gas to, but it's not enough, because on the other hand, the gas deposits are they're too big for Israel's own good, but they're too small to justify these mega infrastructure projects like an East Med pipeline all the way to Greece. At the end of the day, this is just 350 BCM. It's not a lot in a global perspective. And to build a $7 billion pipeline that will be the longest and deepest underwater pipeline in the world for 350 BCM, it doesn't really justify it financially. And so Israel is kind of stuck between the two. It needs to find more gas, or it needs other countries to share also their gas fields, like Aphrodite in Cyprus or the gas fields in Egypt, to make this kind of pipeline worthwhile. So Israel needs the countries around it to cooperate and to get along, right? Especially if it wants the East Med pipeline, then we need to agree who the EEZ here actually belongs to. And otherwise, there'll just be no new exploration and no new export pipelines in Israel's future, other than what it's already selling to Jordan and Egypt, and that's just a third of what it has to sell in the next 30 years, right? So if it has 350 BCM to export, it's selling Jordan 45 BCM, it's selling Egypt 85 BCM. That's just a third. There's still 2/3 of gas to sell, and there's no one to sell to. So, and this is frustrating to Israel, because there's no reason for an international energy company to actually come and look for new gas fields in Israel. Because even if they find gas, they have no one to sell it to. And how do they know that they have no one to sell it to? Because even Leviathan can sell, or doesn't have any market to sell 2/3 of its gas to. So there's no reason to come look for gas. And it's very frustrating to Israel. And Israel needs to show the world, and especially international investors, that it has somewhere to sell its gas to. And so long as Turkey and Greece and Cyprus aren't getting along, it's a hard sell. Now, this also informs Israel's negotiations with Lebanon over the contested maritime border over here. Israel's interest is to solve this as quickly as possible. It wants to settle this sooner rather than later, so it can show international investors that it knows how to play nice with its neighbors. Because if there's conflict over the borders, no one will want to come in and look for it. It wants to show the world that Israel can provide a stable regional business environment that is lucrative and that is cooperative. Israel is continually frustrated that it can't get. It had 4 rounds of bids to sell its fields for licenses to look for new oil and gas, and it hasn't found a serious company to buy it yet for 4 rounds. And it's very frustrating to Israel, while Lebanon did manage to get Total and a major Russian company to come and look for gas. Israel has been so far unsuccessful since Leviathan and Tamar and Karish and Tanin that Aegean bought. And so for Israel, this idea of an East Mediterranean gas forum is very, very positive. This idea of an East Mediterranean region as its own defined region is something that Israel is very positive towards. It really encourages any attempt by Europe to come and be involved in this forum and make it more cohesive and make it more economically influential, and maybe even bring Turkey into the dialogue with this forum. Israel will not be against that, because again, it realizes that it needs Turkey to realize, or at least it needs a complacent Turkey to realize its ambitious regional goals. So Israel has a delicate balancing game. On the one hand, it very much wants to cultivate the Aegean alliance, right, with Greece and Cyprus, with the EU, right, to prevent sanctions, to have this great market, and to create a counterweight to Turkey. But it is also very aware that so long as Turkey isn't speaking to the East Mediterranean gas forum, then the forum mainly holds symbolic meaning. Without Turkey, it's going to be very difficult to actually carry out anything on the ground or right underwater and realize Israel's goals of creating a new region, a periphery alliance 2.0 in East Mediterranean region. So it keeps the door open to Turkey while still cultivating the other allies, Greece and Cyprus. And it doesn't come one at the expense of the other. These are two different alliances that for Israel do not conflict with one another. Israel has its own trade and geographical interests in Turkey, and it has its own trade and geographical interests in Cyprus and in Greece. And these two don't conflict in Israel's minds, but they do very much conflict in Cyprus, Greece, and Turkey's mind. So it creates a huge headache for Israel. I will end with one point on a new kind of player that's coming in, or maybe two kind of players that's coming in. One is very desired by Israel and the other is not desired at all. So the player that's coming into this region and is very desired by Israel is the UAE. After the Abrahamic Accords, the UAE has done two major kind of energy-related decisions. One is to sign a deal with Israel with the Qatsa pipeline, right? Qatsa, the pipeline that originally was built between Israel and Iran, to sell oil through the Qatsa pipeline into the Mediterranean Sea. And the other is to buy a quarter of the Tamar gas field, right? So a company that is directly related to the UAE government has already bought a 25% stake in Tamar gas field. And for Israel, that's very positive. That's bringing finally a major Arab player with a lot of money into the game that maybe can kind of talk between the sides. It's not that the UAE has a perfect relationship with Turkey either, but it is much better than the countries that are currently negotiating. And so it has the potential to be very positive. I would say one comment about the Qatsa deal, where the UAE brings oil through the pipeline. It's a nice addition for Israel, and for Israel, it's great because if something happens with Turkey, then it can get its oil from the south. But it's not that important geopolitically, and it's not a huge disaster if there is no oil deal anymore. The reason I'm saying it is because there's a lot of environmental problems with all of these new UAE tankers coming into Eilat and potentially destroying the coral reefs over there. So geopolitically, it's not that important. And the UAE is already in the East Mediterranean because it bought 25% of the gas fields, whether this pipeline oil deal continues or is canceled. So this is the kind of good addition to the region. The undesired addition to the region, and the reason why this region needs to be cohesive and needs to plan together its policy responses as part of kind of a East Mediterranean Gulf forum, is Russia. Russia is an undesirable player, at least for Israel's eyes. I said earlier that Israel is frustrated that it can't sell licensing bids to its fields, but Lebanon did manage to do it and sell it to a major Russian company. Now, it's important to understand why the Russians are looking for gas in Lebanon. They don't expect to find gas, and even if they do find gas, they don't expect to find a lot of it. Russia is not concerned with gas in Lebanon. It's not the reason why Russia keeps trying to buy gas fields in our region. The main reason is because it gives them access to the Mediterranean Sea. It gives them an excuse to have naval forces in the Mediterranean Sea at all times, because Russia has a geopolitical problem, a geographic problem. If one day, God forbid, there's a war between, let's say, Russia and Ukraine, and NATO starts to get involved, Russia needs to find a way to get its naval forces into the Mediterranean Sea to bypass NATO members and have a more strategic grounding. The problem is, during a war, the only way it can get its ships into the Mediterranean Sea is either through the Gibraltar Straits, which are controlled by the UK, which is a NATO member, or by the Bosphorus Straits, which are controlled by Turkey, who is a NATO member, right? And so that's a problem. It needs to have its naval forces already in the Mediterranean Sea when it starts a war. And it needs an excuse to have the naval powers in the sea without raising alarms. And gas is a good way to do it, right? Keep in mind, the gas in the Mediterranean, there's a good amount of it, and it's great for Israel for the next 80 years. globally speaking, there's not a lot of gas in this region. If we're talking about, 1 TCM, a trillion cubic meters, or let's say 1.5, let's be super generous. Russia has 44 TCM. It's not really a competition here. Israel, for the next 30 years, has between 300 and 450 BCM to export, depending on whether it increases the quota. Just to compare this is what Russia sells just to Europe in 2 years. So it's not really a competition over dominance. It's just an addition. It doesn't really bother Russia that much. It's mainly an excuse for Russia to come in. So the way Russia does this, they buy a licensing area in the East Mediterranean, whether it's in Lebanon or somewhere else, and they send a drilling rig. And then they send a Navy ship, a Russian Navy ship, to accompany the drilling rig. Why? Because suddenly there's a threat to the drilling rig. Suddenly Hezbollah has now huge advanced ground to sea missiles. And it's threatening all of the gas rigs in the area. How did it get these missiles? Who knows? It might have some Russian imprint on the missiles, but they have them. And so now Russia is going to send a warship to protect its Russian gas drilling rig. So you're a country, let's say you're Lebanon, and you have a Russian drilling rig looking for gas for you, and you have Russian naval warships protecting the gas for you, then you're not going to allow it to dock at your port. That's just, bad manners. So it's kind of an excuse to be there and stay there and kind of impose yourself on the host country. And that's kind of a sneaking kind of a strategy that Russia has, and it has exercised it with a lot of countries, and that's why it's doing it. So in June of last year, the Russians started looking for gas in the Lebanese water, and with the gas, with the seismographic vessel, they also sent a Navy ship that was supposed to kind of guard the seismographic ship, the vessel. And if you can see by the GPS over here, right, the little orange line, you can see that the Russian Navy ship didn't just went on its own way. It wasn't ever, it came with the seismographic ship, but then just left and started cruising along Israel's maritime border. So likely this was not this was a monitoring, this was a spy ship. It was monitoring Israeli Navy transmissions. So that's how Russians play the game, and we need to be aware of this. And because of this, the reason I'm saying all of this is that's why we need a cohesive regional policy, and we need to be treated as a cohesive region, as the East Mediterranean, among other avenues through this East Mediterranean gas forum, because we need to, it has a very important role in coordinating a policy response, a regional policy response, and a regional long-term policy in general regarding its natural gas, regarding who do we let come in? Do we just let anyone, the Chinese or the Russians, or do we just let anyone come in and buy the gas? Or do we understand that there are other geopolitical consequences to allowing the Russians to come here? It's not in Europe's interest to allow this. So this idea of creating a cohesive regional policy is very, very important, both to Europe's security, both to this region's economic development and future. And so I'm finished with the presentation, and my final message is I hope that we are able to create this kind of new region of the East Mediterranean. It will be of benefit to everyone, and I hope that Turkey becomes a part one day, an integral part of this region that is being formed.